Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson, Section 20, start of subsection 4. "Come in and have a drink," said Neville 20 minutes later, as the motor drew up at the door of the Elizabeth Street house. Algy had, of course, refused to be set down when the time came, and said that he would walk home. "Well, do you know, I think I will," he said as if he were deciding some important point. "Talking makes me thirsty," he added as an afterthought. "I mean being talked to. Besides, I want to hear what the play was about." "Now tell me the whole thing," he said when he was settled in a deep chair in the library. "That clean-shaven Johnny was her husband, wasn't he?" Neville assured him he was right. "Well, that's all right then. I got that between times, so to speak. And the other Johnny, I couldn't make him out at all. He was after her, wasn't he?" "That was the idea," said Neville. "At least—" "That's good enough for me, then. Well, I thought her ripping." "Who? Oh, Selva, you mean? Yes, she's all right, isn't she?" He found it difficult to attend to Algy, so violent was his preoccupation. A preoccupation, curiously enough, with the thought of Enid now, rather than of Selva. For somehow it appeared to him that Enid was just a shade displeased with him, and that this had shown itself, not indeed in anything she had said, but by a kind of faint film over her manner, as he had seen the two ladies into their motor, and wished them good night. It was very slight, so slight that he was not at all sure whether it were not sheer fancy on his part. And it was this doubt that preoccupied him, for he could not imagine, if it were so, what was the matter. Certainly he had praised Selva, but then Selva was a genius. There was only one opinion on that point. Was it conceivable that the girl did not like his going out between the acts, both times, for a cigarette with Algy? But she had urged him to. Besides, it was incredible anyhow. Was there a single piece of negligence anywhere on his part? He ran his mind back over the evening. He could remember nothing that was at fault. It must be, if there were anything in it, that she did not like his not agreeing with her about Selva. But how could he agree? There was only one opinion. Then, with one of those inconsequent acts of the will that people make in order to quiet uneasiness, he decided that he was being foolish, and that nothing whatever was the matter with Enid, unless perhaps she were a little tired. Then he suddenly yawned uncontrollably, and became aware that he was very tired himself. Algy rose promptly to his feet. "Good night, old man. I'm off. After that, you know." "I'm sorry," said Neville. "No, sit down again. Have another whiskey." "Couldn't dream of it. No, I'm going." "Is that the program? Let's have it, will you? I must mug it up. Never do, you know, to have seen Selva and not know what the play was about." "Good night, old man. Thanks very much and all that. No, don't ring. I'll let myself out. See you on Tuesday, then?" "Well, if I actually said so," said Algy. Neville felt entirely disinclined for sleep when the boy had gone, in spite of his cavernous yawn just now. It was the kind of weariness that leads to mere inertia, that holds one in a deep chair, always considering the duty of going to bed, yet hindering one from performing it. It was a quiet, studious-looking room, this in which he sat, in which no one ever studied. The walls were lined with locked bookcases, whose contents, enclosed in brass lattices, were of a discouraging character. Hansard was there, row after row of him, bound in neat leather with white labels. There were such works as agricultural dictionaries, volumes of dreary travels, bound pamphlets, some 18th century poets, volumes of divinity, portfolios of engravings, tied together with green ribbon bows. On the tops of these bookcases stood plaster casts of Greek philosophers. Let into panels over the fireplace was an oil painting of nymphs disporting under very heavy-looking trees. Yet the room was very pleasant. It had a deep Turkey carpet, a large sensible leather-covered table with solid carved chairs. The mahogany furniture was highly polished. There were fine brocade curtains, drawn back now from the tall windows to let the cool air in. On the table lay a heap of illustrated papers, and the tray with siphons and whiskey. It was very quiet here, too, since it looked on to the garden of the house, and the noise of London was no more than a distant rumble, like the sound of waves upon a beach. Here then Neville sat and thought, too weary to move. Presently, in spite of that faint preoccupation which, driven from the foreground of his thoughts, still occupied the background, he began to think of Hartley. He had been there last night, at this very hour, sitting up in the hall. Aunt Anna had gone to bed nearly an hour before. He had sat up there, smoking and looking forward to the next day. All the lights had been turned out except one. He had turned this out himself, and groped his way upstairs in the dark. What an enormous while ago it seemed. And then suddenly he began to long for it. To long for it, not as it had been last night indeed, but as it had been 3 weeks ago. On that first evening, for example, after Enid had come. It had been exactly perfect. They had played foolish games in the hall, the three of them, and Mrs. Bessington, murmuring sentences from time to time, which occasionally he had answered, had regarded them over her knitting. Of course, it was simply delightful to be up here, and Enid only 2 streets away. He was to look in next morning, by the way, and see if any appointment had been made by the lawyers. But London somehow did not seem an ideal background. It was a shade too feverish. The academy had been oddly fatiguing. Selva, though stimulating, had been a little exhausting too. This very room in which he sat had not the cool spaciousness of the hall at Hartley. Open windows in his bedroom, presently, would not be the same as those open windows that looked out onto the gray moonlit fans of the cedars on the lawn. So his thoughts moved on, as if they were very nearly external visions that passed before him, rather than ideas generated by himself, as his drowsiness increased. And then suddenly, in a great flush, romance poured back, that romance which Selva had illuminated by her genius. He saw himself again in that splendid comradeship which had dawned on him for the first time in connection with a woman, when he had begun to understand Enid. He saw how ludicrously he had been at fault just now, when he had conceived, even as a doubtful possibility, that she was a little displeased with him. How could she be? For the understanding was perfect. Again, then, he saw himself and her, not merely as husband and wife, but as comrades, neither of whom could have a thought or a desire of which the other was not aware. And this comradeship was now romantic in an even higher sense than he had imagined. For he had seen passion as well tonight, and in its rosy light every cooler relationship glowed transfigured. It had been, in that play, a passion that had held tragedy, and a passion that, under these particular circumstances, could have no issue but one. Well, but his own had no tragedy in it, because the relationship was perfect. It was not to be the mating of 2 hopelessly dissimilar characters, but of 2 who, in the great and fundamental things, were, as he had told Aunt Anna, absolutely one. There could be no tragedy there. What, after all, did externals matter? How could it matter whether they were here or at Hartley, in this cauldron of suppressed and seething life which was named London, or in the cool spaces of Hartley, with the cedars and the hall and the river and the pavilion, that dear home of his, of which Aunt Anna was so graceful a symbol? Then, in sudden contradiction, he began to think of the most light externals of them all, of Enid's blue filmy gown, and the row of sapphires, the blue flowers in her hair, her clear pallor, the glance of her eyes as, now and again, he had met them with his own. Subsection 5. Mr. Charleston gave quite a start as he came round the screen, and saw Neville lying there in the deep chair. He had made certain, as he had said to Mrs. Ferguson next morning, that Sir Neville had gone to bed, and left the lights burning, as young gentlemen will, without ringing the bell. He advanced a step, and coughed discreetly. There was no movement on that sleeping face. The young man was lying back, his head drooping on one shoulder, his arms dangling down over the sides of the well-padded chair. He looked dead tired. Mr. Charleston coughed again. Then he put his hand discreetly on his master's shoulder. "Beg pardon, Sir Neville." "Eh?" Neville sat up suddenly, bewildered with the sudden awaking. He looked blankly at the servant. "Eh?" he said again. "Beg pardon, Sir Neville, but it's gone 12, and not hearing the bell, I thought—" "After 12, is it? I've been asleep." He stood up as he made this brilliant discovery. "Beg pardon, Sir Neville, but you look very tired, Sir Neville," proceeded Charleston, who, while not daring yet to aspire to Masterson's familiarities, occasionally was a little paternal. "Better go to bed, Sir Neville." Neville stretched elaborately. "Quite right, Charleston, as usual. By George." Charleston waited. "I do feel cooked." "First day in London, Sir Neville. What time in the morning?" "I think we might say 9, and breakfast in my room at 1:30. Yes, certainly this bedroom was not like Hartley. In Hartley one could move about freely. There was a wide space between the mirror and the bed, where one could even do exercises before one's bath, if one was in a virtuous and strenuous mood. But here, scarcely. He remembered Algy's confounded clumsiness before dinner, and the looking-glass, too, of all things. The rumble of the streets, too, was far more considerable here even than in the library. Elizabeth Street itself was fairly quiet, but from the thoroughfare, which led to Victoria 100 yards away, life was in full movement. He could hear the run of wheels, the hooting of a motor, all the more distracting since they were not quite continuous. He undressed slowly, yawning again once or twice, and got into bed. The very sheets felt different. They had not that same sweet country smell that his sheets had had last night. Then he switched off the light and arranged himself. How dog-tired did he feel, to be sure. Enid. That was the point. He would see her tomorrow. He would think about her now. Enid. Subsection 6. Enid was perfect next day. She said she would certainly come and meet Selva again. That Selva, whatever one might think of her acting, was a great personality. You weren't angry with me yesterday? She asked, looking up at him from her low chair, with a touch of pathos that went straight to Neville's heart. She did look a shade paler than usual. Angry? With you? Why? He went off into a torrent of expostulation. That's all right, she said. I knew it must be so, but I was foolish. Neville? Yes? You will tell me, won't you? Just as we agreed, when you're not quite pleased with me. Why, my darling. But you will. Of course I will. She nodded. That's all right, then. And you must keep your side of it, too, he said. Well, if you really wish it. Of course I do. That's part of the arrangement. I shouldn't dream. Well, I will, then. Oh, dear me. What is it? I feel tired. I didn't sleep very well last night. I was anxious. I thought I'd done something. Neville was overwhelmed with shame, particularly when he remembered that he himself had fallen asleep in his chair. I'm a brute, he said. Look here, I must make a confession. She smiled up at him. Go on, my dear. I slept too well. I fell sound asleep in my chair. Charleston woke me up and sent me to bed. You poor dear, you did too much. You're not strong, you know. No more headaches? Oh, no. And please remember, I'm quite strong always, as strong as a horse. I am, you know. She sat still in her low chair, looking at him. Then she lifted her arms a little. Give me a kiss, she said. I heard the bell go. That'll be the lawyer.